You're listening to Einfach gelöst, and this is Urs. With me today are two of the biggest names in Agile. One is a professor, the other is CEO. They were consultants both. The board of Scrum Alliance, they're both certified Scrum trainers. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Tom Mellor and Mr. Mike Cohn.
Thanks for having us here.
Welcome to the show. Would you introduce yourselves to our audience in your own words?
Tom Mellor, and I'm not a big name in Agile. I was more behind the scenes, behind Cohn and others, trying to sponge all the information I could get because I knew nothing about Agile. I didn't even know what the word meant. I had been sentenced to be a project manager at an insurance company in the United States, State Farm. And when I became one, I became totally exasperated over how they were doing work. And I wasn't alone in that. It was all set up on predictability, defined process, a lack of change, right? And when we did do change, we had to go through an onerous change control process. It took months and months to deliver product. When we delivered it, it often was not very satisfying to our customers, mainly because over the course of 18 to 24 months, things had changed and we were in the dark about those kinds of things. So the short story is I read an article in Software Testing and Quality Assurance magazine when I was taking a break in the project manager lounge at State Farm. And it was an article by Ken Schwaber. And after I read it, I went, this is intriguing because this is completely antithetical to how we do work. And I would assume how many large corporations do work. So there was an invitation at the bottom of the article. If you want to know more about Scrum, please contact Ken Schwaber. He had his email at the bottom. And so I emailed him immediately. And I didn't think I would hear back from him. I thought this guy's busy. He probably gets dozens of emails from people. And 15 minutes later, I had an email back from him. And he said, "Hi, Tom. Thanks for reading my article. I'm glad you enjoyed it. You were either the dumbest person I've ever heard from or the craziest. But either way, give me a call." So he put his cell phone number in there. And I picked up the phone immediately and called him. And when he answered, I said, "Hi, this is the dumb, crazy guy from State Farm." He goes, "Yeah." And so we had a 45-minute conversation, which entailed what it might take to try to use this at a large corporation. His procrastination that I would probably be fired over it. And if I was, then I could reach out to him and maybe give me a recommendation. And so that's how the conversation went. I basically, he said, I'm sure you're process driven there. And I said, yeah, we have a standard methodology. And he goes, what do you use? And I said, Coopers and Lybrand and Summit D. And he started laughing. And I go, why is that funny? And he goes, the first project that we used Scrum on was to automate processes for Coopers and Lybrand Summit D. I said, oh, the irony. And he goes, yeah, Jeff Sutherland asked me if I was using Summit D to manage the project. And he goes, no, we're using Scrum. So we had a connection immediately because of that. And I told Ken, I said, look, I think I can do it here and I can do it surreptitiously. We had 10,000 people in our IT department. And I said, it's easy to do things here without drawing attention. He said, well, I think you're going to draw attention if you do this. And I said, possibly. But I said, I hope it's a good attention and not a bad one. So when I visited with my director about it, she goes, that's interesting. It's an interesting approach to work. I said, it is, I think. It's completely novel. It will certainly be to us. And then she looks at me and she goes, so what's your risks in using this? And I said, oh, we fail. And she goes, no, that's not a risk. And I said, that's not a risk. She goes, no, that's an expectation, Tom. He said, okay, Meredith, what do you think the biggest risk is? And she goes, I'll tell you what the biggest risk is. This actually works. Then what do we do? Because it's going to draw attention if it actually works. And so we used it on a small project and we were supposed to deliver in 90 days and we delivered in 60. And it was to our bank and our bank had already told us you can't tie your shoes in 90 days over there. We don't really hold out any hope for this. So when it when we did deliver and they had the pizza party for us, because that's what they do in big corporations. And if you do really well on something, they allow you to have toppings on your pizza. A senior vice president showed up at the pizza event, a guy named Jack North. I asked one of the project sponsors, I go, "What's Jack North doing here?" And she said, "You're going to find out in a minute." So he comes over to me and he goes, "I want to know how you did this." And I said, "We used an approach called Scrum." And he kind of looks away and he goes, "Can you use Scum on a big thing?" And I go, "Well, it's actually Scrum, Jack, but let's not worry about details here." I said, "What kind of big thing?" And he goes, "We need to rewrite our entire mortgage system by the end of this year." And it was 2004. And I said, "That's 7 months from now. How, uh, how long did it take you to write the original system?" And he said, 2 years. I said, "No, we're not going to do it in 7 months. We're not going to rewrite an entire huge system in 7 months." So again, he looks away and then he looks back at me, and as executives do, he goes, "Will you try?" And I said, "Okay, if we're going to negotiate and you're going to corral me into this," I said, "I'll try, but I said, I'll tell you what, we're going to run into all kinds of bureaucratic crap, and I'm going to need your help in setting that stuff aside because it'll slow us down to a crawl." And he gave me his word. He said, "Any problems you have, you come to me." And he held a big hammer. I mean, he was at the senior echelon of the company. So when I did have problems, I did come to him and I said, "I need your help, Jack, because we're starting to get disgruntlement from the project management office about this and that. Plus, we're going to be going through an audit from outside from a regulatory organization." I said, "They're getting nervous about that." He said, "That's fine. I'll take care of it." And he did. He took care of it. Now, we did not deliver by the end of the year. We actually delivered 3 weeks later. So we delivered in about 8 months, which we had workarounds for things that we couldn't deliver. And again, they threw another pizza party for us with toppings. And the CEO of State Farm Bank delivered a commendation letter to everybody on the team. Nobody had ever seen that done before. People received commendation letters, of course, but they had never been delivered in person by a senior executive.
Wow. Great.
And so, you know, and also at that meeting was the director of the project management office, who I didn't know had been invited, and I'm not sure he ever had been invited, but he pulls me aside and he goes, "We're coming up with a new methodology. You won't have to use this Scrum stuff anymore." I said, "Okay." And
Thank you.
"I'd like you to come. We want to debrief you on this." And I got into a room about the size of my office with about 8 other people in there, and they just started interrogating me. "How did you do this? How come you avoided processes that we've had in place?" I finally got to the point where I said, "Look, the bank is completely satisfied with the outcome. I don't know why you're focusing on this minutia when we got an excellent result out of this." And what they couldn't control was the fact that it then became viral throughout our technology.
Mhm.
And pretty soon I was coaching and they said, "Hey, how do you train this stuff?" And I said, "Well, you got to become a certified Scrum trainer." "How do you do that?" And I said, "I'll have to check with Ken Schwaver about that. I have no idea how you become this." So Schwaber said, "They want you to become the internal trainer for Scrum?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Okay, let's co-train together." And at that time, Mike might have a little different opinion on this, but basically you got blessed by Schwaber to become a trainer. Yeah, that's how it worked. In fact, we were training together in Grand Rapids and I was sitting with his wife, Chris, off to the side of the room, and he's doing his part for this certified Scrum Master course. And he just stopped right in the middle. And I thought, he's lost his train of thought. He's not sure. And he turns and he looks at Chris and he just says to her, "Okay, he's ready." And then he turns back and he starts addressing the group again. And I turn to Chris and I go, "What's that all about?" And she turns to me and she goes, "Well, congratulations. I guess you're going to become a certified Scrum trainer."
Well, congratulations.
And after that, he invited me onto the board because I had some prior board experience for nonprofits. And, he was a strong mentor to me because I always called upon him. He told me, buy the book I wrote with Mike Beadle and follow it like a recipe book. So I still have that book and it's torn and highlighted and written all over. I would run into something and I'd read into the book and then I'd call him and I'd go, it says to do this, but I don't know. And he goes, just use your intuition. You're going to make mistakes. That's fine. Make mistakes and move on. But he said, the number one thing is keep the power to make decisions and decide how to do the work in the team. Don't direct them or anything. And he goes, they'll make mistakes and they'll expect you to be condemning of them. You be supportive of them. You know, you you tell them it's okay. And if they run for the cliff, you go over the cliff with them. You might tell them they're running for the cliff, but if they decide to go over the cliff, you're going over too. So I had no technical background. I came from the business side. So I took coding courses in Java and in Python, and I eventually became minimally proficient at writing code, but I could understand code syntax and, I paired with people occasionally to code. And so that's the story. And then after that, I eventually retired from State Farm in 2013. I went on my own and consulted and taught. And then I actually retired from that as well, right at the end of COVID. And then Illinois State came to me and said, would you be interested in teaching information systems in the business department at Illinois State? So that's the only classes that I'm teaching now. I don't do any public or other private classes. So that's kind of a long introduction, but that's the background I've got, and that's it.
Thanks, Tom. Mike, what about you?
Well, I got lucky and was doing Agile before it got named that, and it had just come about from a project that I was on that was bigger than projects I'd done before, and I realized that how I'd done things in the past wasn't going to work. And I went back and read a book that I had on my shelf called Wicked Problems, Righteous Solutions, and it had a little kind of 2 or 3 page description of what it called Scrum, and it talked about how this was done in some hardware companies, and it basically said, wouldn't it be neat if somebody tried this on software? This was in October of 1994, so I decided to try that on the project that I was working on then. And similar to Tom's story, was phenomenally successful. So I went on to use Scrum on projects in that company. That company was buying a couple companies a year. As we did, I would end up running those development groups and introduce Scrum into those organizations, and just kind of went from there. Ended up leaving, doing my own consulting thing for the last 25 plus years, just because I love the way of working that it is. I don't really care about Scrum or XP or any of the brands there. I'm known as a Scrum guy, but the things that I mostly use, are from extreme programming.
Mhm.
And I just like how it frees up people's creativity. That's what's always done it for me. And so it's just been my passion for 30 plus years now.
Yeah, cool. So how did you first get in touch with Agile, Mike?
So how did I get interested or get more exposed to Agile? I was part of the old Comp Lang forums on Usenet, and Jeff Sutherland, Bob Martin were posting on there. Jeff was posting about something that kind of evolved into Scrum. You wouldn't recognize it as Scrum these days. It had these things called sync steps, and there were gaps between sprints and stuff. But he was posting about that, and it was intriguing. And so I had that. I had the original papers on Agile or on Scrum from Professor Cohn at New Mexico State, the Wicked Problems, Righteous Solutions book. There was also a book by Dave Olson on complexity theory and software development that was influential from the mid-90s. Those just kind of influenced how I was doing things. And so we had kind of evolved our own process that was very similar to what Scrum and XP became. And I remember in, 25 years ago this weekend, basically, I got an email from Ward Cunningham, who I was working with on a project, and Ward emailed me and said, hey, look what I did this weekend. And it was a link to the manifesto page that he'd put up that weekend. And it kind of caught my attention as kind of summarizing a lot of what I'd already been doing, right? But it codified it, put it into words. And what was nice about that was up until the manifesto was written, you really felt like you were on your own, right? There weren't a lot of people doing this. And if there were, you didn't know who they were. And I mentioned that we were buying companies. And I remember buying companies and they'd have these like really fancy documents, the type of thing Tom was talking about, State Farm might have done. And I remember thinking, I was like, wow, we're so successful. I wonder if we'd be more successful. We wrote all these documents. Unfortunately, I was too busy to ever write those documents, but it was there. It's just like nagging doubt in your head, right? It's like, when is what we're doing not going to scale? When is it not going to work? Should we get heavier weight with this stuff? It was there as a doubt, and I'm willing to admit that. And I remember the day those doubts went away was when we bought a company that had a requirements document that was beautiful colors printed. We had this meeting with them right after we bought them. And they gave all of us copies of their requirements document, and all of the pages were put into sheet protectors, like, those plastic things to keep the pages. And those look great, right? And I remember asking the VP of development there, who was now reporting to me, I said, "What do you do when requirements change? You got to print all this over?" It's like, "We don't let requirements change." I'm like, "Oh, no."
Right.
Oh, we don't let requirements change because we'd have to reprint things and put them in the sheet protectors. And so all the doubts went away, but I still felt kind of alone in the world. And then when the manifesto came out, Ward sent me that. It's like, aha, there are other people doing this. And I'm going to suspect that that's what some of the signatories felt this as well. It's probably part of why they wanted to get together was like, hey, what do we all have in common? We're out there talking about this and we're doing lightweight methodologies. Let's talk and see what we have in common. And it was that feeling of being part of something bigger than that. And right after that, that led Mary Poppendick and I to create the Agile Alliance. So Mary Poppendick and I were the two that, brought in everybody else that was part of the manifesto because we wanted to centralize that, have a place where people could join and be part of something.
Cool. Thanks. So, Tom, Mike just mentioned how he first got in contact with the Agile Manifesto. What about you? It's 25 years now. What did you do 25 years ago, and who sent you an email?
So, um, you know, I was not familiar with the manifesto at all. My first exposure was my conversation with Schwaber, and I had no idea that behind the scenes was this aggregate group of people that had set forth values and principles generally about, they were framework or methodology agnostic about it. They go, look, there's dozens of different ways of doing this probably, but these are things that we want to have in common. And so, as I started to get more information from Schwaber, my recollection is he goes, you probably need to look at this document. And at that time, and I think you still are allowed to sign it, right, virtually.
Mhm.
You can put your
Yeah.
name. So I put my name on it and talked. I didn't know any of the signatories to it. I knew, of course, now of Schwaber. I'm co-training with Schwaber in a class, and he goes, I want you to meet somebody. And so he pulls this guy up. He's kind of dumpy. I don't want to be disrespectful, but he'd probably agree. He's got a shaggy beard, and he goes, I'd like to introduce you to Ron Jeffries. And I said, oh, it's very nice to meet you. I had no idea who the hell John Ron Jeffries. So Schwaber started explaining to me. He goes, oh yeah, he was heavily involved in XP and blah, blah, blah. And, the whole bit. And I said, so what's he doing here? Schwaber leans over to me. He goes, he's going to become a Scrum trainer, but he's got to go through the class first. Okay.
Yeah, that was a big discussion back then, right? About integrating XP into Scrum in some way or fashion.
Yeah, I think Andy Hunt had some opinions about that and other people. Chet Hendrickson, who was also at the class, but I remember first meeting Jeffries and then I met Hendrickson later. And those two were thick as thieves everywhere. So they were a Laurel and Hardy show if there ever was one. But, and then like I've never met Ward. Alistair Coburn always calls me Steve because he gets me confused with Stephen Mellor, who signed the manifesto. And then he asked me, he goes, do you know whatever happened to Stephen Mellor? I go, I'm no relation to him. I don't know what happened to him. And Alistair goes, I think he was a design guy. That's what I think. And I said, possibly. I don't know. But he still calls me Steve when he sees me. So I never did break him of that. So I met Alistair and like I met Lowell Lindstrom, and Lindstrom tells the story about how I think he was the chief operations officer, right, for Bob. And Bob goes, hey, a bunch of us are getting together to kind of hammer out commonality among different approaches to this. Would you be interested in going? And Lindstrom says, I don't know, where are you going to have it? And he goes, well, we were going to have it in the Caribbean, but Coburn has insisted that we have it at Snowbird because it's right outside of Salt Lake where he lives. And he goes, you're going to Snowbird in February and you're not going to ski or anything? no, we're going to be inside hammering this stuff out. No, I don't think I'm interested in going. And he looked at me, Lowell and I worked together quite a bit. And he looked at me and he goes, you know how you have big regrets in your life? Yeah, I wish I'd have gone to Snowbird. But he goes, I just thought it was going to be a little meeting and they were going to maybe come up with some general ideas and then hammer them out later or something like that. I had no idea what was going to happen there. And maybe they didn't either. I don't know. There's lots of stories that come out about what happened there. Colburn told me that Highsmith basically had already come up with the principles. Now I've heard different versions of that, but there's, who knows? I've been in the room at Snowbird. It's not much. I went in there and thought, I wonder if there's any ambiance in here. Will I feel any, Jedi mind melding or anything in here?
Kind of like walking across Abbey Road with some friends.
Some things happened here, but it seems very nondescript to me.
Cool. So that's 25 years ago. Things have happened since then. Agile has taken off. Scrum is the default way of working for many companies. What do you think? What was so important about that? Why did it have the impact it did?
One of the things I liked in the early days is that there were a set of Agile approaches, right? There was DSDM, there was feature-driven development, Crystal kind of, Scrum Extreme Programming. And each of them played to its own strengths. And I remember talking to people and saying, look, if you're really into prototyping, go with DSDM. If you're really into kind of like, UML, hardcore, like main programmer, then feature-driven development might be the one you want to go with. And I think Scrum is the lightest weight of all of those. And it's a really good starting point for pretty much anybody, right? Kanban didn't exist back then, but certainly does now. And the way I like to think about it is if a team starts with Scrum and really lives it, right? The whole inspect and adapt, change things in retrospectives, they're going to invent DSDM if they like prototyping. They're going to invent Kanban if they're more about flow. So Scrum is a great starting point that will lead people to those other processes, not exactly, right? And not necessarily a name, but they'll invent those processes. And I think that's what really helped Scrum become the dominant one. I think another part of it was Ken called me one night after he'd been at a company Kodak, the old film company, right? And he goes, they want to buy Scrum, but I don't know what to sell them. It's just an idea. And he had basically an old PDF laying around on his hard drive. And he goes, I think I'll sell them that. And I'll have my programmer make an Excel spreadsheet and let's certify them in Scrum. And so he came up with that out of a desire for people to have something that they could own. We've got to go back to the era when that was happening. That was 2003 when Scrum started its certification thing. And I was very opposed to it at the beginning, still kind of am. I mean, it's been part of my living, of course, but up to the night before, I was trying to get them to call it something else. But it caught attention from people. And it caught attention from companies because they wanted something they could own. And what was important to remember in that era was that was when people were getting in trouble for having 4 lines of open source code that made it into your code base. I remember one of the articles was Google's entire code base may end up having to be open source because somebody slipped in 4 lines from some Linux distro or something. It was like just ridiculous. But companies were terrified of that. You weren't allowed to use open source in your projects because of this. And so Ken needed something that he could say, you own this after you take a class, right? You have permission to do this. And so that's what led to the certification model. And then, again, a PDF and a little Excel spreadsheet that he gave just so they felt like they had something tangible.
Tom, any additional thoughts? Why did it have the impact it had?
Well, I think, Mike might differ in opinion, but I think the number one thing that made Scrum prominent was the certification track. And that was a chagrin to a lot of people, right? What are you getting certified in? You're now a certified Scrum Master. Does that make you an expert? What does it do? And I think it was at the core marketing thing. I mean, so it spread the word of Scrum. People were taking classes right and left because you didn't have classes in XP. You didn't have classes in Crystal. You didn't have classes in any of that stuff, right? You had people that came in and taught it to you, consultants, but generally, there was no kind of, you're now a certified XP programmer. So XP has rightly or wrongly been focused on programmers, right?
And was much too extreme for general uptake.
It's in the name.
Crystal's been focused on project management. Coburn will readily admit that.
Coburn
Whereas-
says Scrum is just an implementation of Crystal.
Yeah, right. So there's lots of things about that. Martin Fowler famously confronted Schwaber about flaccid Scrum because you have nothing in here about technical excellence or anything like that. And he wrote a post about it and caused some rancor and that sort of thing. But at the core, Mike and Ken and Jeff all said, look, we give you basically a framework to organize your work. If you're committed to technical excellence, you'll build that into the framework. You'll do test-driven development, you'll do continuous integration. You'll do those kinds of things that are advocated in extreme programming. You may even pair program. It's hard to say, but those kinds of things that you find valuable and beneficial to you, you'll integrate. And Schwaber one time could say to me, there's nothing startling complicated about this. And when they developed the Scrum guide, it was 13 pages or whatever, right? It's like, this is the entire textbook of Scrum. So,
You know what's weird? Both of you just now mentioned that Scrum is very much a roll your own approach, like find out what's really important and integrate that into your framework, and you'll end up with something that's better than what you have now. And with people I'm talking to, corporate people coming to me as a CST to learn about Scrum, they're very much about give us the right way to do Scrum, the way that we'd never have to change again and just can keep doing it. And what is Scrum and what is not Scrum and all these delineations. And so I wonder, when did that change? Where did we as trainers or as consultants go wrong? So people want the one true Scrum instead of building in what's most important to them.
Well, thus came safe, right, Mike?
Yeah.
That's exactly what emerged.
I don't think we went wrong. I think that that's just a mindset that a lot of people are in, right? Tom mentioned State Farm using the Coopers and Lybrand methodology. I used to run into a lot of the Anderson Consulting Method 1 approach, right? And so you'd have these big, huge methodologies. And the company that I went into in October 94, that project that I mentioned, I was a new hire there about a month before that. And my boss had shelves of documentation from various processes that he was reading. And this is just when the companies were starting to put their processes onto CD-ROM instead of giving you 6 feet of binders. But you'd pick up a binder, here's how to do a design meeting, here's who should be there, here's how long it should take, or questions to go over. And it was 6 feet of documentation on how to run every possible thing in a process. Yeah, there's a lot of appeal to that. That, honestly, that sounds great. If I can, run it like a cookbook. Well, no, I'm serious. Doesn't that, I don't have to worry about, have to think it through. I have to trust my ability to reason through it. It's just like, hey, here's a proven perfect approach. It doesn't work though, right? That's the problem, right?
Yeah.
But I can totally understand why that would be appealing, right? And so I think leaders in organizations see that and find it very appealing. And my wife is you call it a certified public accountant. I remember watching her work on a plane one time, and she was doing some budget for an audit. And, I'm into planning and stuff like that. And I said, well, how accurately do you have to plan these audits? She goes, oh, if I'm off by more than 3%, I'm probably fired. Right. And, Tom, at the start of this, was bragging, and rightfully so, about only being 3 weeks late on a 7-month project. I can't do the math in my head, but that's more than 3%, right? And Tom did a great job. That project earned him toppings, probably 2 toppings on his pizzas, right? But, my wife, the auditor, has to plan things within 3%. She goes, well, we look at how many facilities they have, what the revenue was. We have formula, we adjust it, and, we got to be within a couple percent.
Yeah.
And my wife is the type of person who then ends up as this auditor. She could be a CFO and then the CEO of a company. And now she's in charge of software development. Says, plan your projects within 3%, right? And the three of us are going, no, right? That works on an audit where it's very similar to the audit last year, but it doesn't work on something creative, right? You don't know, right? It's all the movie studio film budget overruns, right? They're totally analogous to what we do. So I get the appeal of some really locked down methodology, but once you know enough about software development, that doesn't work.
What Mike's alluding to is there's a high level of risk aversion in corporations. So the more processes you have around and the more you mandate the use of those processes, the more the corporation sees the diminishment of risk, right? So we have risk control around these things because we have tight controls, tight processes. And then what they have failed to traditionally understand is now we're introducing a different risk to it. And that's the risk of a lack of quality, right? A lack of, what we call the normalization of deviance. So now I'm under time pressure, right? Or budget pressure. I got to be within the 3%. So we're just going to start ignoring standards. NASA shuttle pilot Mike Mullane has done ad nauseum series about what happened to the Challenger space shuttle when they ignored Morton Thiokol's warnings about the solid rocket booster O-rings and things like that. So, the one side of, hey, we really want to control risk here, and we're going to do that by imposing a huge bureaucratic process to you, versus the other risk is, we're going to slow them down significantly. They're going to have to take more time to do all these steps, and that's going to increase cost. And so now they're under two different pressures, right? The one pressure is finish within 3% of the budget, finish within 3% of the estimated time. And by the way, follow all the processes that we've dictated to you. So frameworks like SAFE, they've tried to leverage a lot of intermediate steps, and that's comforting to corporations, and they've tried to maintain some sense of agility in it. We could argue ad nauseum about that, but it pacifies that side of the corporation. Like, oh yeah, now we can actually have, 25 teams working on this because we have a framework that will allow us to effectively manage in an agile manner 25. So
Yeah.
I think it's dubious, but that's my opinion.
I think the biggest risk is not building what the customer wants, right? And we can follow this process documentation that's meant to avoid schedule risk and cost risk, but it doesn't alleviate the cost of building the wrong thing. And, we can kind of, look at executives and organizations and say, oh, they're afraid of risk. That's why they choose all this. We're choosing to use Scrum because it reduces risk, right? Different
It's
risk,
risk
right?
management, right?
Right.
It is
Yeah.
risky.
I choose Scrum because it's the most likely thing to get me to the result I want. That is, I'm avoiding the risk of building the wrong thing. So we're avoiding risk too, just a different type of risk by choosing the processes.
And
we choose.
it's not as explicit. Like, we do these short iterations, we do these sprints because if we go wrong, somebody will tell us, hey, you went wrong there, please reconsider. And that's a kind of risk management, but it's not the tabular percentage impact and so on and so forth kind of risk management. It's just
absolutely.
an empirical
Short
approach.
iterations get rid of a lot of risk.
Right.
Yeah,
Cool.
I remember when I was first starting to use Scrum, and executives would come to me and they go, well, when are you going to be finished with this? And I used to just take great joy in this. And I go, I have no idea when we're going to be finished with it. And they would lose their minds. And I said, rather than focusing on whatever finish means, why don't we focus on how fast we deliver valuable product to them, and then let them judge when it's sufficient, or maybe we run out of money or whatever, right? In the old way that we did things, to Mike's point, we would take months and months to deliver something, and then the customers would look at us and go, this is exactly what we don't want. And it would have been nicer had you found out earlier that this wasn't what we wanted, because now you can't change it because you've run out of money or you've run out of time. And now we're forced to eat this. It's not food that we want, but it's food that we're given. And we have business processes we have to sustain, and this isn't going to help the matter any for that.
Yeah. Reminds me of a product owner I once worked with. He and his team, they had a great Scrum process running. They had beautiful retrospectives where the process really improved for the team, and all the stakeholder feedback got in except for one thing. They weren't allowed to change one thing about the product backlog.
We're going to lock down them requirements.
Yeah, right.
But the sheet
It was brilliant. Like these 120 items, and whatever came in went to 121.
We want that entire product backlog developed right at the beginning.
The problem I have with that is there's various people that go out and they'll study successful projects, right? And if you're going to study successful projects, you have to have a definition of success. And the definition is usually on time, on budget, with all scope delivered, right? And I have been doing software development for 30 plus years at this point, 40 years even. And I've never succeeded by that definition. I've never delivered on time, on budget with all planned features. And here's my request. If I ever do, shoot me, right? Shoot me. Because it means I've stopped thinking. During the project, we didn't come up with one better idea that could blow away one of those 120 backlog items you mentioned, right? Somewhere in there, I'm going to come up with a better idea. And if I'm not thinking anymore. That is the opposite of a successful project to me.
Yeah,
You might get a
absolutely.
pizza with toppings though, Mike. You got that going for you.
So we've been looking at the past. We've been looking at what came from that. So what do you think will come next? What's up for the world of work in general, or what's up for Agile in specific?
Well, artificial intelligence, that's right at the front of everybody's now, So we just had a big discussion about that over the weekend, Is it going to eliminate developers? We actually had a developer come in who's using the Copilot agent, and he goes, it's a phenomenal tool. He goes, it does not replace the human analysis that needs to go into it. You still have to have strong technical skills. A lot of it is on the text that you write when you want it to do something, the prompt, they call it. So did I write the prompt correctly? And you still have to understand the code it generated. Like a non-technical person could write a prompt into a Copilot agent. It could spit out the code. It could actually run. I don't know, Mike, I'd be interested in your take on this, but Steve, my friend, said, we were really heavy into test-driven development for years, but the Copilot AI agent has effectively eliminated test-driven development because it also writes the tests and runs against the tests. So he said, we still have to look at what tests it wrote because we have to validate that what it's testing is what it should be testing, and it's, it's properly formatted and it expresses what we want. So I said, you don't write any of your own tests anymore? He goes, we don't write any of our own tests. We use the agent to write the tests.
Yeah, use the agent for the test, writing the test and the code.
Right.
I think what we're seeing happen is that for the last 55 years, ever since the term software engineering was coined, we've assumed that the programming was the hard part. And it has been. It has been the hard part. And we saw that get easier, ignore AI for a moment, but we saw that get easier when we went from writing things in assembly language, like when I first started, to writing things in kind of second generation languages, third generation languages. And we saw 4GLs come out. I remember being loving working with a tool called Delphi in the 90s. It was a Borland tool that was just really
My first
easy
coding
to do.
tool.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, there are times I missed Delphi. I needed something last week, and I'm like, I ended up doing it in Codex, but it was like, I wish I had Delphi. It was fun. It was just a cool environment, nice single user apps. But we saw this progression where coding was getting easier and easier and easier. Now, again, ignore AI for a second. If we just would have extrapolated that 20 years longer, I'd just go another 20 years without AI, but improvements in languages and things, I think we would have gotten to a point where programming was no longer the hard part. And what AI's done is it's accelerated that. It's made it happen already, right? Programming is no longer the hard part. The hard part is what Tom talked about. It's getting that prompt right, is getting the specification to the tool correct. And so I think we're going to see more and more emphasis on, we can call them backlog requirements, whatever you want to call it, but we're going to see more emphasis on getting those things correct into the AI tools to generate the code for us. I remember when I was working on my master's in computer science, ended up being in metrics, but I was researching various things what I want to write about. And at the time, there was something called automatic programming. And automatic programming was the idea that a user could just talk to a computer somehow and give them some sort of specification. And back then, there was a lot of talk about how this might have to be done in formal specification languages, like one was called ZED, Vienna Development Method. But there were basically like these symbolic notations for describing your system. And I was like, this is never going to work. And of course, it never did. But now we're at the point where users can truly talk to an AI, talk or type it in, but, give AI the requirement and get decent systems out of it.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I'm working on a small side project with my wife who's doing something for a client of hers, and she gave the prompt to her AI tool the other day. She's not a software developer and never has been, and it spit out something which was obviously wrong and not what she asked for. And I have been a software developer in the past. I took a prompt, I added some bits and pieces, I added some data formatting, I added some expected output formatting, gave the prompt to this very same AI system, got exactly the code she wanted. This told me that software development skill is still important, even when prompting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be that, and I'm going to change it a little bit from what you said, development skill. It's more that problem solving skill that programmers have, right? It's that ability to think through and know where things might go wrong and how it might get misinterpreted by, in the code, and that ability to explain things at a really good level, right? And then to troubleshoot when you get that back, right? When you get that back, a non-programmer is going to have a harder time figuring out, okay, I didn't get what I wanted. What do I change, right? They're going to have a harder time than that. I think to me, that's the creativity that programmers have always had. And I think what we're going to see is it's going to enable us to go more quickly. It's going to enable us to iterate over ideas, right? Your wife might have got that back and said, oh, this is close, but oh, wouldn't it be nice if we also had this feature, right? And we can iterate over ideas, again, reducing the risk of building the wrong thing. And so we're going to see faster iteration. That's going to kind of blow up the concept of sprints. I think there'll still be some sort of time boxing concept of like, hey, let's see what we can do in a week, right? But it's no longer, and it hasn't been for a while, tied to the delivery of the system. It's more just we didn't see weeks go away, right? I mean, everybody has a concept of a week, right? So we're still going to have the concept of iterations, but they'll just be kind of boundaries around work. And I think it's going to enable new systems to be built that could not have been built cost effectively in the past. So I think we're going to see a lot of new development opportunities. The other thing I think from what you're describing there, let's talk about your wife's system for a second. She gets it right. You help her. It ends up being a perfect system. One of the things that I suspect people will do in that situation is save the prompt that they submitted, right? Because when I want something later, I want to give it the same prompt. Now, I'm going to put it in my terms. I'm going to save the product backlog, right? I'm going to save the user stories, the job stories that I gave it, because when I want to make enhancements or completely rewrite the system or the functional area of a system, I want to make sure it does all the same old things and now does these things. So we're going to see product backlogs switch from being kind of disposable as they've been in the past. I've been very adamant about that they should be disposed of them. You don't need to save your product backlog, to now they're going to be first-class artifacts. We're going to want to keep them in version control, and be able to resubmit them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder what will come of refactoring in a world like that. Because right now refactoring is that skill where we go into the code and rebuild it so it doesn't change the output behavior, but it's more clean and more organized. And now am I going to refactor my prompt and rebuild the entire module by Copilot, or what will happen to it?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the definition in Fowler's book, it was changing the structure, but not the behavior, right? And so we might go into a product backlog and take something that was expressed as a functional requirement, now expressed as a non-functional requirement. Or we might change its structure by moving where it is in the prompt, right? Or saying it's optional, or adding acceptance criteria right in the prompt instead of letting the AI figure that out. So we're going to be kind of changing the structure of those things, and refactoring will move up a level, right? We'll maintain our backlogs, and we'll have to be paying attention to how they're written more so than we have in the past.
One of the things that Steve told me is that the Copilot agent is not good at refactoring, that they still have to examine code for syntax and for brevity and adjust it manually, because it'll spit out code, but it might not be the most elegant code that it can produce. It's looking to fulfill the prompt of it needs to do this. So the other thing that he mentioned, which is a can of worms, and this is just the general risks that go around AI, like what do you allow into your code base and not allow in? What kind of external risks are present, when you're relying on an artificial intelligence tool to basically survey all of its knowledge and then come back with something? Is there anything nefarious that could be introduced, right? And the other thing is, how do you protect your stuff like data and things like that you have to be careful about exposing to the agent, because then the agent could memorialize that and end up using that data outside of your company.
Yeah. And what will the agent do to the code? Will it phone it home, no matter whether it's to Beijing or Moscow or Seattle? and tell them, there's this guy working on a really interesting project. Maybe we want a shot at it.
I mean, I think you have to be sensitive about those things because while the tool is enormously valuable and very robust, it also is arguably lacking guardrails around it, and you have to basically self-impose guardrails when you're using it. That's their take on it.
As far as that's possible with something that runs on somebody else's computer with somebody else's code.
Yeah, he equated it to the old USB, he goes, would you allow anybody to stick a USB into your computer? I said, no. And he goes, it's sort of the same mentality we have around AI generated code. It's like we're sticking a USB in here. We're not quite sure what's on it, so.
What's the best way to decide what's on there? Having humans test that at the volume that can be generated, or having a separate AI, one that you help train yourself, look for vulnerabilities, right? And it may now still be humans, but at some point that there will be companies selling AIs. They'll be like MPC or something that will, FCP, that will evaluate the code written by another AI, right? And look for vulnerabilities that's been trained on these type of vulnerabilities that looks for them.
Yeah.
That's got to be automated at some point.
There'll be a technology solution for the risk. That's what always happens.
Yeah.
Well, they'll come up with something. But again, it exposes them in a way that they haven't realized before, because a lot of systems were tightened down. You couldn't, either send data out, it was blocked or things like that, or you couldn't allow data in. And now you have to figure out what new guardrails do we have to put in place, whether they're technological or human oriented, you still have to worry about that. And it's the Wild West right now when it comes to AI.
Right.
There's no doubt about it,
Recently, I spoke to a guy who told me he had a very prototypical system like that in place, where one AI generated code, the second AI checked it and handed remarks back to AI one. And then if the output passed, that's fine. If it didn't pass, a human got alerted.
Yeah, we have one that does page generation. So the new pages on our website are generated by an AI that we've built. And then we have another one that tests it.
I think I'll add on to Mike's point, and this was expressed yesterday in a person that came on and Zoomed with us. He's a product owner, and he said, there's probably going to be demand for fewer programmers in the future, but he said, they're going to have to change a skill set significantly. It's not just writing code anymore. It's how do you prompt? How do you leverage AI? How do you monitor? Do things like that. But he said the incumbency is going to be on product owners to understand these things just as thoroughly as developers do. No longer will the product owner just be a business person that goes, I don't know, write a prompt for that.
We're going to see a merging of the business skills and the development skills, right? I remember encouraging that, way back when I first started managing people, is I wanted the ones that cared about what we were building, right? They cared about the business. I didn't like the ones that were, in the common parlance, just code monkeys, right? Just tell me what to code, I'll code it, leave me alone. But I wanted the ones that cared about it. They wanted to understand the business so they could go, oh, I could do that, but, right? And they'd come up with those side paths that might make it better or might make it worse, right? If they hadn't been thought of. And those are the types of developers who are going to succeed. I think the code monkey job, just tell me what to code and go away, it's become AI.
Now, finally, I would love to know, is there anything cool you would like our audience to know about, something you're doing right now, which the world should hear of?
I don't know that I ever do anything cool.
You always do, Mike. What's your new book about?
No, I mean, we're just, my company, Mellor Software, we're just kind of continuing as we have been, which is focusing on helping teams kick ass. I mean, that's just what I've always been interested in. And like I said, Agile was the way for me to do that. And I was doing it before it became known as Agile, but it was all about good teamwork. And so we're kind of just largely doing the same thing. We're focusing on, incorporating more AI in our client work into our class experiences, things like that. But it's really just continuing with the same old of, let's help teams be awesome.
With you, Tom?
Mike's a lot cooler than I am. I'm trying to teach young people who I hope want to learn, right? All different aspects of information systems and then walk out there into the world. They're all anxious as hell. AI is at the top of their minds. Is my job going to be replaced? What skills do I have to have coming out of here? And it's interesting because employers report back to us, they're going to learn these kinds of skills, AI and technical skills and things like that. We'll teach them that. What we don't see coming out of them is the ability to work effectively in teams, to communicate. So they write emails like they text. They can't have crucial conversations with people they don't understand. How you get to what we call a pool of shared meaning in that. How do you get a win-win situation out of something? So we work earnestly on helping develop those social skills that, like Mike said, I'm no longer going to go into a closet and write code. That's not happening anymore. I'm not going to
That's a
do
good
that.
point. I think those soft skills that you're focusing on, the communication skills, they've always been important, and now they're going to become even more important because you have to communicate with your team, even if your team is smaller, and you got to communicate well with the AI, right? We're back to, giving it a good prompt. So knowing how to communicate well with a human or an AI is becoming more and more vital.
So thank you guys. Thanks for coming to our show. It was a great conversation. Thanks for all the insights and predictions.
Thank you, Urs.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.